The crumpled $5 bill lay between Zoe Hamilton's trembling fingers like a final lifeline. She sat alone at the pristine white tablecloth, surrounded by the soft clinking of crystal and murmured conversations of Manhattan's elite. This was it, $5 for a blind date that had to work. Had to. At the corner table, Alexander Reed lowered his newspaper. His steel-grey eyes tracked every nervous gesture as she smoothed the worn bill flat. His son Mason looked up from his coloring book, whispering something that made his father lean closer. The waiter approached with leather menus thick as novels. Zoe's pulse hammered against her throat. She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of being watched by a stranger who somehow seemed to see everything. Zoe tucked the $5 bill beneath her phone and glanced toward the entrance for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Blake Harrison was already 15 minutes late, and each passing second felt like a small betrayal of her carefully constructed hope. She'd spent her last subway tokens getting here, riding 3 trains from Queens to reach this gleaming fortress of Manhattan dining. The journey had taken 90 minutes, but she'd needed every minute to rehearse conversations that might lead somewhere beyond this moment. Her carefully pressed interview suit felt thin as paper against the leather banquette, the fabric stretched tight across shoulders that carried too much weight for someone her age. The hostess had given her a look that could freeze water when she'd asked for the Harrison reservation. A subtle up-and-down assessment that catalogued her discount store accessories and second-hand purse with professional disdain. Now she sat surrounded by the soft hum of prosperity, watching servers glide between tables laden with wine bottles that cost more than her monthly rent. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh roses, a world away from the antiseptic hospital corridors that had become her second home. She pressed her palms flat against the table's cool surface, anchoring herself against the urge to flee. Alexander Reed folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, the Financial Times crackling like autumn leaves between his fingers. The headlines spoke of market fluctuations and corporate mergers, but his attention had drifted entirely to the young woman 20 feet away. Mason had stopped coloring his dinosaur family long enough to point toward Zoe's table with a green crayon, his small voice carrying just enough for Alexander to catch the word, worried. The boy had an uncanny ability to read emotions that adults tried to hide, a skill developed during too many months of watching his mother fade away in hospital rooms just like this. Alexander's chest tightened as he recognized the particular brand of quiet desperation radiating from the woman's table. The way she held herself when she thought no one was looking, the careful arrangement of her limited resources, the practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. 3 years ago, he'd worn that same expression while counting quarters for Rebecca's pain medication, back when insurance companies found creative ways to deny coverage for experimental treatments. Money hadn't been the issue then, but bureaucracy had made him feel just as powerless as the woman across the room appeared now. The restaurant's crystal chandeliers cast warm, honey light across white tablecloths, each table a small island of controlled luxury. Zoe felt cold despite the heated interior, her nervous energy radiating through her fingertips as she checked her phone for the 5th time. Blake's last text message simply said, "Looking forward to tonight," followed by a winking emoji that had seemed charming 12 hours ago, but now felt vaguely mocking. They'd met through her college roommate Sarah, who'd insisted that Blake was exactly what Zoe needed right now, with the confident certainty of someone who'd never needed anything more urgent than a good manicure. What she needed was a job, health insurance, and enough money to keep her mother's experimental cancer treatment going for another month. What she had was $5, a prayer wrapped in desperation, and the slowly dawning realization that she'd pinned too much hope on a stranger's potential kindness. Her stomach growled softly, a reminder that she'd skipped lunch to save money for tonight's inevitable disappointment. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was starving in one of Manhattan's finest restaurants, surrounded by people who spent more on appetizers than she had for groceries this week. Blake Harrison finally appeared at the hostess station 22 minutes late, his charcoal suit immaculate and his confidence preceding him like expensive cologne. He moved through the restaurant with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any space, nodding to the maitre d' like an old friend. When his gaze landed on Zoe, she caught the brief flicker of assessment, the way his eyes catalogued her appearance, and found it acceptable enough to proceed. His smile was practiced and professional, the same expression she imagined he wore during successful business meetings. "Sorry I'm late," Blake said, settling into his chair without removing his jacket or offering a more specific explanation. Conference call with Tokyo ran longer than expected. You know how it is with international markets. He didn't wait for her response before signaling the waiter with two confident fingers, a gesture that summoned immediate attention. "We'll need menus and your wine list." Something impressive, but not ostentatious. The waiter materialized instantly, the kind of service that money commanded and expected without question. Blake barely glanced at Zoe as he continued speaking, his attention already dividing between her and the important messages lighting up his phone screen. "I hope you don't mind, but I've got another commitment at 9:30, so we should probably order quickly and get the conversation flowing." His tone suggested this was a reasonable request rather than a dismissal of her worth. "Sarah mentioned you work with kids. That's admirable, I suppose, though I've always wondered how people in helping professions manage financially." Zoe's throat tightened, but she managed what she hoped passed for an understanding smile. "Of course, I completely understand that work comes first." The words tasted like copper pennies, but she forced them out with practiced grace. She accepted the leather-bound menu from the hovering waiter, its weight substantial enough to feel like a weapon in her hands. The moment she opened it, her heart sank toward her stomach with the inevitable gravity of disappointment. No prices were listed anywhere, which in Manhattan meant everything cost more than her monthly food budget combined. The cheapest item she could identify was a house salad, but even that was described with ingredients that sounded expensive enough to require their own insurance policies. Truffle oil, imported burrata, microgreens grown in some artisanal greenhouse upstate. She closed the menu carefully, buying precious seconds while her mind raced through impossible calculations. $5 might cover a side of bread if she was extraordinarily lucky, but luck had been in short supply lately. Her palms were sweating against the leather binding, leaving small fingerprints that felt like evidence of her inadequacy. Alexander watched the subtle pantomime unfold from his corner table with growing concern. The woman's shoulders had drawn inward the moment she'd opened the menu. Her breathing had quickened to shallow sips of air, and now her fingers were pressed flat against the table's surface, as if anchoring herself against a storm only she could feel. Mason had abandoned his coloring entirely, his dark eyes fixed on the drama playing out with the intense focus children reserved for situations they didn't understand but knew were fundamentally wrong. "Daddy," Mason whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 7-year-old wisdom. "Why does the pretty lady look like she's going to cry?" Alexander didn't have an answer that wouldn't break his son's heart, or require explanations about a world where good people suffered through no fault of their own. Instead, he reached across the table and squeezed Mason's small hand, a gesture that had become their silent language for are complicated, but we're going to be okay." Blake's attention had already wandered to his phone, thumb scrolling through emails with the practiced efficiency of someone who viewed human interaction as just another item on his daily agenda. "Sarah mentioned you work with kids," he said without looking up. "That's nice work, I'm sure. Rewarding in all the ways that don't pay bills, right?" He laughed at his own observation, a sound without warmth or genuine humor. "I'm in investment banking myself. Just closed a deal worth $12 million this week. Not bad for a Tuesday, even by my standards." The waiter hovered nearby with professional patience, clearly sensing that the table was ready to order, but uncertain about the dynamics playing out between his customers. Blake gestured dismissively toward the server without interrupting his phone activity. "Give us another minute," he said, then looked directly at Zoe for the first time since sitting down. "I'll have the Wagyu, medium rare, with the seasonal vegetables. And you'll have—" He paused, finally giving her his full attention with the expectant air of someone accustomed to efficiency. "What catches your eye?" Zoe's cheeks burned as she reopened the menu with trembling fingers. Every option seemed designed to mock her situation, a catalogue of impossibilities disguised as choices. The Wagyu Blake had ordered so casually likely cost more than she'd spent on groceries in the past month. Maybe 2 months if she was being honest about her recent sacrifices. She found the salad section and read each description twice, hoping for mercy. But even the house salad was garnished with ingredients that required their own zip codes and probably had their own publicists. "I'll just have water for now," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the table. "And maybe we could share an appetizer." The words felt like swallowing broken glass, each syllable a small surrender of the dignity she'd been desperately trying to maintain. She forced what she hoped passed for a casual smile, as if sharing food was a charming quirk rather than economic necessity. "I'm not terribly hungry tonight. Big lunch. You know how it is." Blake's eyebrows lifted in an expression that suggested he very much did not know how it was. "Just water? Are you on some kind of cleanse or health kick?" He laughed again, the sound echoing slightly off the restaurant's marble surfaces. "Come on, live a little. This place has a James Beard Award and a waiting list longer than my last vacation. Sarah said you were fun and spontaneous." The waiter shifted uncomfortably nearby, clearly accustomed to more decisive ordering and increasingly aware that something was wrong with this picture. Blake's tone carried the edge of someone whose generosity had very specific limits and expectations attached. "Don't tell me you're one of those women who pretends not to eat on dates. I hate that game. It's dishonest and frankly insulting to the restaurant." His words hit the air between them like small explosions, each one designed to establish dominance through casual cruelty. "I made a reservation at one of the best places in the city." The least you could do is appreciate the gesture. The words hit Zoe like physical blows, each one finding its target with surgical precision. She felt the heat of embarrassment crawl up her neck as nearby tables began to take notice of their conversation. The couple at the adjacent table had stopped their own discussion entirely, their attention now focused on the small drama unfolding 20 feet away. "I'm not pretending anything," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm simply not very hungry tonight." The lie tasted bitter, especially since her stomach had been growling for the past hour, a constant reminder of the lunch she'd skipped to save money for this evening's inevitable disappointment. She'd been living on coffee and hope for longer than she cared to admit, another small sacrifice in an endless series of compromises that had become her daily reality. The irony of starving in a 5-star restaurant wasn't lost on her, but it felt too pathetic to acknowledge even to herself. Alexander's hands clenched involuntarily around his coffee cup, the porcelain warming under his grip as he fought the urge to intervene in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond casual rudeness. The woman's dignity in the face of Blake's casual cruelty reminded him painfully of Rebecca during those final months, when she'd insisted on maintaining appearances even as their world crumbled around them. His wife had faced her diagnosis with the same quiet grace, refusing pity even when accepting it might have been easier for everyone involved. Mason had picked up his green crayon again, but instead of coloring, he was staring at Zoe with the intense focus children reserved for situations they didn't understand, but instinctively knew were wrong. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. "That man is being mean to the lady." Why is he being mean? The question hung in the air between them, simple in the way that only a child's observation could be, cutting straight to the heart of something adults had learned to complicate with social conventions and polite excuses. Blake glanced around the restaurant with obvious irritation, his patience clearly exhausted by what he perceived as unnecessary drama. "Look, I don't mean to be difficult here, but this is getting awkward." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice without making it any less cutting. "I made a reservation at one of the best restaurants in Manhattan, took time out of my schedule, and you're sitting there ordering water like we're at a coffee shop." He gestured vaguely at her barely touched water glass, his movement dismissive and final. "Sarah told me you were going through a tough time, but I assumed that meant something emotional, maybe a bad breakup or family drama. Not?" He paused, letting his eyes sweep over her carefully arranged appearance with newfound understanding. "This. Whatever this financial situation is supposed to be." Zoe felt something fracture inside her chest, a small but crucial piece of the armor she'd been wearing for months finally giving way under the pressure. The careful composure she'd maintained through job interviews, medical appointments, and increasingly desperate phone calls to insurance companies began to crumble as Blake's words stripped away her last pretense of normalcy. She reached for her purse with trembling fingers, fumbling for the $5 bill that represented the sum total of her liquid assets. "Maybe I should explain," she began, but her voice caught on the words like they were too sharp to swallow. The medication bills, the experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, the job she'd lost after too many absences caring for her dying mother. None of it would matter to Blake Harrison. She was simply a woman who couldn't afford dinner at his chosen restaurant, and that single fact had reduced her worth to zero in his carefully calculated social equation. Mason tugged insistently on his father's sleeve, his small fingers urgent against the expensive fabric. "Daddy, we should help her." The boy's voice carried clearly across the quiet restaurant, causing several diners to glance toward their table with varying degrees of curiosity and discomfort. "She looks like she needs help, and you always say we should help people who need help." His logic was simple and unassailable, the kind of moral clarity that adults spent years learning to complicate with excuse and social conventions. Alexander felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried during those long nights in hospital waiting rooms, when Rebecca's condition had worsened and hope had become a luxury they couldn't afford. He thought of his wife's last words about kindness being the only currency that truly mattered, about how helping others was the best way to honor the help they'd received when everything seemed lost. His wallet sat heavy in his jacket pocket. But this wasn't really about money. This was about recognizing when someone needed to be seen as fundamentally human. Blake's patience finally snapped with an almost audible crack. "You know what? This is embarrassing, and I don't do embarrassing." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made several nearby diners wince. I thought I was meeting someone who had her life together, someone who could hold up her end of an adult conversation. Not... He gestured dismissively at Zoe's careful arrangement of her single $5 bill on the table. I have a reputation to consider in this city. People I know eat here, people I do business with. His voice carried across the restaurant with the kind of authority that comes from never having been truly challenged. Maybe next time be upfront about your financial situation before wasting someone's time. There are cheaper places to meet if money's an issue. He straightened his jacket with sharp, angry movements. Sarah owes me an explanation for this setup. The silence that followed Blake's departure felt deafening, as if the entire restaurant had collectively held its breath and forgotten to exhale. Zoe sat frozen in her chair, the $5 bill still clutched between her fingers like evidence of some crime she hadn't meant to commit. Conversations gradually resumed around her, but she could feel the weight of curious stares from other diners, that particular mixture of pity and judgment that made her skin crawl with shame she hadn't earned but couldn't escape. This was worse than being poor, she realized. This was being poor in public, reduced to entertainment for people who would never understand what desperation actually felt like. The waiter approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but professionally obligated to address the obvious problem. "Miss," he said quietly, "would you like me to call you a taxi?" The kindness in his voice almost broke her completely. Alexander made his decision with the certainty that had built his business empire. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to the restaurant's manager, someone he'd known for years through various business dinners. "Please charge Table 12's entire evening to my account. Tell the young woman her meal has been taken care of anonymously, and that she should order whatever she'd like." He showed the message to Mason, who nodded solemnly, as if they were planning something of vital importance to the universe. "Sometimes," Alexander whispered to his son, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise, "strangers need to know they're not invisible. Your mother taught me that helping people isn't about what you can afford to give, but about what you can't afford not to give." Mason absorbed this wisdom with the seriousness that 7-year-olds brought to life lessons that would shape their understanding of right and wrong for decades to come. The manager approached Zoe's table within minutes, his demeanor transformed from professional courtesy to genuine warmth. "Miss Hamilton?" he said, somehow knowing her name. "I apologize for any inconvenience this evening may have caused. Your table's entire bill has been settled by another guest who wishes to remain anonymous." He handed her a note written on the restaurant's cream-colored stationery, the paper thick and expensive between her fingers. Zoe's hands shook as she unfolded the message, expecting some form of pity disguised as charity. Instead, the words were simple and direct. "Dignity doesn't have a price tag. Order whatever brings you joy tonight. The world needs more people like you. A friend who understands." The handwriting was masculine but careful, each letter formed with the precision of someone accustomed to signing important documents. At the bottom, a small postscript. "P.S. Some of us have been where you are." It gets better. She looked up sharply, scanning the restaurant with new eyes and a suddenly racing heart. Her gaze swept past the elderly couple sharing dessert, past the business associates deep in conversation over wine that probably cost more than her monthly utilities, and landed on the corner table where a man in a navy suit was helping his young son pack crayons into a small backpack. For a moment that felt suspended outside normal time. Their eyes met across the dining room. Alexander didn't smile or nod or give any indication that he was responsible for the sudden reversal of her evening's fortunes. He simply looked at her with the kind of recognition that passed between people who understood loss, who had counted their last dollars, and wondered how they would make it through another day. His expression was neither pitying nor proud, just quietly understanding in a way that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. Mason had turned completely around in his chair now, his coloring book forgotten in favor of watching the real-life story unfolding before him. "Is she going to be okay now, Daddy?" he asked in a stage whisper that somehow felt more appropriate than the hushed tones of the other diners. "Is she going to smile again?" The questions carried the weight of a child who had watched too many adults struggle with problems bigger than any single person should have to face alone. Alexander stood slowly, gathering their things with deliberate care while keeping one eye on the corner table where Zoe was reading his note for the second time. "I think so, buddy. Sometimes people just need to remember that they matter, that their story isn't over even when it feels like it might be." As they prepared to leave, Mason waved shyly at Zoe with the unself-conscious friendliness that only children possessed, and she felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in months. The manager had returned with a fresh menu and the restaurant's wine list, his earlier indifference replaced by attentive courtesy that felt genuine rather than purchased. "Please, take your time, Miss Hamilton. There's absolutely no rush this evening." He gestured toward the menu with a flourish that suggested infinite possibilities rather than impossible choices. "Our chef has prepared something special tonight that isn't listed, a butternut squash soup with local herbs. Very comforting on a cool evening like this." Zoe stared at the list of options that had seemed so impossible 30 minutes earlier, each item now representing possibility rather than mockery. Her eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for weeks, not just because of the unexpected kindness, but because someone had seen her struggle and responded with grace instead of judgment. She ordered the soup, something warm and nourishing, that felt like being cared for by someone who understood that healing came in many forms. Alexander paused at the restaurant's entrance, his hand resting protectively on Mason's shoulder while they waited for their car to arrive. Through the large windows, he could see Zoe sitting straighter now, the terrible tension finally leaving her shoulders as she spoke with the waiter. She was actually smiling, a transformation that reminded him of watching Rebecca emerge from her darkest moments during treatment. The resemblance was more than physical. It was the particular strength that came from refusing to be broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Daddy," Mason said, tugging on his father's hand with the persistence that had made him an effective negotiator since he could speak. "I want to learn how to help people like that lady. I want to be the kind of person who makes sad people smile." Alexander squeezed his son's fingers, feeling Rebecca's presence in the autumn air that swept through the restaurant's revolving door. "We just did, buddy. And we're going to keep doing it, because that's what good people do." 3 days later, Zoe found herself standing outside the gleaming glass tower that housed Reed Technologies, clutching a business card that had appeared with her restaurant check, along with another note. The message was brief but intriguing. "If you're interested in discussing opportunities in pediatric therapy software development, please call. We could use someone with your background and perspective. A.R." She'd researched the company obsessively, discovering that Alexander Reed was the CEO who'd lost his wife to cancer and was now dedicating significant resources to medical software innovation. The symmetry felt too profound to be mere coincidence, as if the universe had conspired to create connections between strangers who needed each other in ways they were only beginning to understand. The receptionist directed her to the 42nd floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park. Alexander's office was warm and unpretentious, filled with Mason's artwork and photographs of a woman with kind eyes who could only be Rebecca. Family pictures showed a life that had been full and happy before being cut short by circumstances no amount of money could control. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Hamilton," Alexander said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair positioned to take advantage of the spectacular view. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of looking into your background after our brief encounter the other evening." He smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. "Your work in pediatric trauma therapy is impressive, particularly your research on helping children process medical experiences through interactive technology." Zoe felt a heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with curiosity about how much he actually knew. "I'm not practicing anymore," she said, looking down at her hands, the same hands that had counted that $5 bill just days earlier. "I had to stop when my mother got sick. The treatments are experimental and expensive, and insurance companies have creative ways of avoiding coverage for anything that might actually help." The admission felt easier here somehow, in this space that acknowledged loss without drowning in it. Alexander nodded as if her explanation made perfect sense, as if he'd heard similar stories too many times to be surprised by the failure of systems designed to help people in crisis. "Rebecca was a child psychologist too," he said quietly, his voice carrying the particular gentleness that comes from speaking about someone whose absence never stops being noticed. "She always said that the people who understand suffering make the best healers, that empathy can't be taught but only earned through experience." He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, its contents organized with the precision of someone accustomed to making important decisions quickly. "I've been looking for someone to head our new division, developing therapeutic software for children dealing with medical trauma. The position comes with full benefits, a salary that would allow you to continue your mother's treatment, and the opportunity to help thousands of families going through what you're experiencing right now." The offer felt surreal after months of rejection letters and doors closing in her face with increasing finality. "Why me?" Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't really know anything about me, except that I couldn't afford dinner at an expensive restaurant." The question hung between them, loaded with all the self-doubt that months of financial desperation had accumulated like sediment in her confidence. Alexander smiled again, this time with the warmth of someone who recognized a kindred spirit across the vast distances that usually separate strangers. "I know you maintained your dignity when someone tried to take it away from you. I know you care more about your mother's welfare than your own pride. And I know that Mason hasn't stopped talking about the brave lady since that night." He paused, looking out at the park where autumn was painting the trees in shades of hope. Sometimes the best qualifications can't be listed on a resume. 9 months later, Zoe's corner office overlooked the same park where she'd once walked to clear her head during her mother's worst days, when hope had seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. And each day brought new evidence that the world wasn't designed for people like them. The software program she'd developed was being tested in children's hospitals across the country, helping young patients process medical trauma through interactive therapy games that made healing feel like play rather than work. Her mother's treatment was working, not miraculously, but steadily, giving them hope they hadn't dared feel in months. The experimental immunotherapy that had seemed impossibly expensive was now covered by Zoe's comprehensive health insurance, another reminder that sometimes salvation comes disguised as opportunity. The $5 bill sat framed on her desk, not as a reminder of desperation, but as proof that dignity maintained in the darkest moments could transform into dignity restored when the light finally returned. Alexander knocked on her office door, Mason's hand firmly clasped in his as they prepared for their weekly lunch tradition. What had started as business meetings had gradually evolved into something more personal, more healing for all of them. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked, using Mason's term for their explorations of family-friendly restaurants where everyone could afford the menu and no one had to count their money before ordering. Mason ran to Zoe's desk, immediately drawn to the framed $5 bill that he'd heard the story about dozens of times, but never tired of discussing. "Tell me again why you kept it," he demanded, with 7-year-old insistence, as if the answer might change or reveal new layers of meaning that had escaped his previous understanding. His questions always cut straight to the heart of things that adults learned to complicate with unnecessary explanations. "Because," Zoe said, lifting the frame carefully as if it contained something precious and fragile, "it reminds me that sometimes when you think you have nothing left, you're actually at the exact moment when everything changes." She looked at Alexander, who was watching them both with an expression she was learning to recognize as love, though neither of them had been brave enough to name it yet. "Your father taught me that kindness isn't about what you can afford to give. It's about what you can afford not to give." Alexander stepped closer, his voice soft enough that only she could hear above Mason's excited chatter about their lunch plans. "Rebecca would have liked you," he said, the words carrying weight that came from months of careful consideration. "She always said the best partnerships aren't built on what people have, but on what they've overcome together." Mason tugged on both their hands, impatient with adult conversation that didn't include him or address the important question of where they were going to eat. "Can we go now?" Mason demanded. "And can we go somewhere where everybody can afford the food and nobody has to be scared about money?" His request was simple and wise, the kind of insight that comes from watching adults navigate problems that shouldn't exist in a world with enough resources for everyone. They laughed together, the sound carrying easily through the office as they prepared to leave for another meal where the only thing that mattered was being together. 12 months after that night in the restaurant, the local newspaper ran a feature about Reed Technologies' innovative therapy program and its impact on pediatric healthcare across the region. The article mentioned Dr. Zoe Hamilton's groundbreaking work and the personal experience that had inspired her approach to helping children maintain dignity during medical treatment. What it didn't mention was the small ceremony held that morning in Alexander's office, where Mason had proudly witnessed his father propose to the woman who'd taught them both that sometimes strangers become family in the space of a single act of kindness. Zoe kept the $5 bill in her wedding bouquet, a reminder that love often begins in the most unlikely places and that the most valuable things in life can't be purchased at any price. During their reception, held in the same restaurant where they'd first encountered each other, she stood to address the gathered friends and family. "I used to think that having only $5 made me poor," she said, her voice clear and strong above the gentle clinking of glasses. "I was wrong. Having $5 and someone who saw my worth despite it made me the richest person in any room." The guests applauded, but Zoe's attention was focused on Mason, who was carefully coloring a picture of their new family at a table where everyone had enough to eat. Alexander reached for her hand, squeezing gently as they watched their son create art from the simple joy of belonging somewhere safe. "Sometimes," he whispered, "the best investments start with the smallest gestures." She squeezed back, thinking of all the people who might be counting their last dollars at this very moment, hoping for someone to see their worth beyond their circumstances. Have you ever had someone see your worth when you couldn't afford to show it? Tell us about a time when someone believed in your potential despite your circumstances. Your story could inspire someone else facing their own $5 moment.